The thermometer outside Morgan Llewellyn's cabin read 12 degrees below zero, and inside, with the fire roaring, his water bucket had frozen solid overnight. 2 miles away in a cave on Copper Ridge, Reese Cadogan sat in his shirt sleeves at a comfortable 53 degrees, his small fire barely more than coals. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more impossible survival innovation. Morgan Llewellyn woke on the morning of January 14, 1860, to a sound he had never heard in 20 years of frontier living. His water bucket, sitting 3 feet from a roaring fireplace, was cracking. Not the wood bucket itself, but the ice inside it. Solid ice inside his cabin, with a fire that had burned all night. He sat up in his bed, his breath visible in the air despite the heat radiating from the stone fireplace. His wife Margaret was already awake, wrapped in every blanket they owned, feeding split logs into flames that seemed to provide light but no warmth. Their 3 children huddled together in the loft, whimpering from the cold that penetrated even their shared body heat. Morgan walked to the door and checked the thermometer he had mounted on the exterior wall. 12 degrees below zero. He had seen cold before. Montana Territory winters were brutal by design. But this was different. This cold had weight to it. It pressed against the cabin walls like something alive, seeking entry through every gap and crack. Inside, despite the massive fire consuming wood at an alarming rate, the cabin felt barely warmer than 40 degrees. Morgan could see frost forming on the interior walls where his breath and the family's body heat met the frozen logs. The chinking between the logs, mud and moss, that had seemed adequate in autumn, had contracted in the extreme cold, opening gaps that let wind knife through. He had built this cabin himself 2 years earlier, 20 feet by 16 feet, using the best timber he could find. Dovetail notches at the corners properly fitted, a stone fireplace and chimney that drew smoke efficiently. 2 windows with real glass he had hauled from Fort Benton, a heavy plank door with iron hinges. By frontier standards, it was a fine structure. By the standards of this morning, it was failing. Margaret fed another log into the fire. They had started the winter with what Morgan had calculated was sufficient firewood, 12 cords split and stacked, enough for a normal Montana winter with surplus to spare. But this was not a normal winter. They were burning through wood at triple the usual rate, and they were only halfway through January. At this pace, they would run out by early March, with 6 weeks of winter still ahead. Morgan looked at his children in the loft. Their faces were pale, their lips slightly blue despite the blankets. This was more than discomfort. This was danger. People froze to death in their own cabins during winters like this. He knew the stories. Families found in spring, huddled together, their fires gone cold after the wood ran out. 2 miles away, though Morgan did not yet know it, Reese Cadogan was sitting at a small table in his shirt sleeves, eating breakfast in comfort. The cave that housed his simple cabin maintained a steady 53 degrees as it had every day since he had moved in 15 months earlier. His fire was small, barely more than coals, consuming perhaps 1/10 the wood Morgan's family was burning, and Reese was warm. Reese Cadogan had arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1856 with his wife Bronwyn and enough supplies to start a new life. They were Welsh immigrants who had spent 5 years in Pennsylvania before the promise of Western land pulled them further into the frontier. Reese was 34 years old, a carpenter by training, and capable with his hands. Bronwyn was 31, strong-willed and unafraid of hard work. They had no children, which some saw as a sadness, but which made the journey west more practical. They claimed land near what would later be called Copper Ridge, in a valley with good water and timber. The location seemed ideal. A creek ran year-round. Pine and fir covered the surrounding slopes. Game was plentiful. Other settlers were scattered within a day's ride, close enough for community, but far enough for independence. It was everything they had hoped to find. Reese built their first cabin that summer using techniques he had learned in Pennsylvania. He selected straight logs, notched them carefully at the corners using dovetail joints, and chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud and dried grass. The cabin measured 14 feet by 18 feet, large enough for 2 people but small enough to heat efficiently. He built a fireplace from river stone, constructing a chimney that drew smoke cleanly. He fitted a solid door and cut one window on the southern wall, covering it with oiled paper until he could afford glass. The work took 6 weeks. When finished, Reese was proud of what he had built. The cabin was solid, well constructed, and positioned on open ground with a view of the valley. Bronwyn planted a small garden near the door. They cleared additional land for future crops. By autumn, they felt established and ready for whatever winter might bring. Their first Montana winter was harsh but survivable. Temperatures dropped below zero for weeks at a time. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel difficult, but their cabin, while not perfectly warm, kept them alive. They burned through more firewood than Reese had anticipated, but they made it to spring without serious hardship. The second winter, 1857, started similarly. October and November brought the expected cold and snow. Reese and Bronwyn settled into the rhythms of winter life. They had stockpiled more firewood this year, learning from the previous season. They had preserved venison and vegetables. They had wool blankets and warm clothes. They felt prepared. December was colder than usual, but manageable. January brought temperatures that tested their cabin's limits. Reese found himself waking several times each night to feed the fire. The cabin would lose heat quickly if the fire diminished. He began to understand that their structure, while adequate by most standards, was inefficient at retaining warmth. Heat escaped through the roof, through gaps in the chinking, through the very logs themselves. The cabin was not a container for warmth. It was a barrier against cold, and barriers could be overwhelmed. February would prove him right in the worst possible way. February 9th, 1857 began as an unremarkable winter day. Cold, but not exceptionally so. Reese spent the morning splitting firewood, while Bronwyn worked inside, mending clothes and preparing their midday meal. They ate together, talking about spring plans and the garden they would plant. There was no indication that this day would be different from any other. By afternoon, the temperature had dropped noticeably. Reese brought in extra firewood, stacking it near the fireplace so it would be dry and ready through the night. He checked the chinking between logs, pressing mud into any gaps that had opened. He banked the fire carefully before they went to bed, arranging logs to burn slowly through the night while providing steady heat. They fell asleep in the warmth of the cabin, wrapped in their blankets, believing they were safe. Sometime after midnight, the temperature outside plummeted. Later, Reese would learn from other settlers that thermometers had reached 30 below zero that night, the coldest reading anyone in the territory had recorded. But in those dark hours, he knew only that something was wrong. He woke suddenly, disoriented. The cabin was profoundly cold. His breath formed clouds in the darkness. He reached toward Bronwyn, intending to wake her, to get the fire restarted. She did not respond to his touch. Her body was cold in a way that stopped his heart. Reese scrambled from the bed and went to the fireplace. The fire had died completely, not banked to coals, but dead. Cold ashes. He did not understand how that was possible. He had arranged the logs carefully. There should have been heat through the night. But somehow, in the extreme cold, the fire had failed. He rebuilt the fire with shaking hands, blowing on kindling until flames caught. As light filled the cabin, he returned to the bed. Bronwyn was dead. She had frozen during the night, quietly, without waking him. The cold had simply taken her while she slept. Reese carried her body outside at dawn. The world was locked in cold, so severe that trees were cracking from the freeze. He could not dig a grave in frozen ground, so he placed her body in the small storage shed behind the cabin, where it would be protected until the earth thawed. He spent the rest of that day sitting in the cabin, feeding the fire, understanding that everything had changed. The structure he had built, the home he had believed was adequate, had failed in its most fundamental purpose. It had not protected the person he loved most. The cabin had seemed solid, but it was not. It was porous to cold, vulnerable to temperature extremes, incapable of retaining the heat necessary for survival when nature turned truly hostile. Reese did not cry. He sat in silence, watching the fire, and began to think about heat and cold and survival in ways he had never considered before. Reese buried Bronwyn in April when the ground finally thawed. He chose a spot on the hillside above their cabin where she could look down on the valley they had hoped to make their home. He marked the grave with stones from the creek and stood there for a long time, not praying exactly, but making a silent promise that what had happened would mean something. Other settlers came to pay respects. They brought food and offered condolences. They spoke about God's will and the hardships of frontier life. They meant well, but their words felt hollow to Reese. This was not about God's will. This was about inadequate shelter and his failure to understand the enemy he was fighting. Cold was not abstract. It was physical, measurable, and it killed when shelter failed. After the burial, Reese returned to the cabin and began to study it with new eyes. He examined every aspect of the construction, looking for where heat escaped. He held his hand near the walls and felt air movement through gaps in the chinking. He stood near the fireplace and realized how little of its heat actually warmed the space. Most went straight up the chimney or radiated toward one corner, while the rest of the cabin remained cold. He started visiting neighboring cabins, asking to see their construction. Some settlers thought his questions were odd, the product of grief-driven obsession. Others were sympathetic and showed him their structures. Reese noted how they were built, where they succeeded, and where they failed. Every cabin he examined shared fundamental weaknesses. Logs contracted and expanded with temperature changes, creating gaps. Chinking dried and cracked. Roofs leaked heat upward. Doors and windows were thermal breaches. Fireplaces were inefficient, consuming enormous amounts of wood while providing inadequate warmth. He began to understand that the standard approach to frontier cabin building was fundamentally flawed. Settlers built structures that looked like shelters but functioned poorly as thermal containers. Everyone accepted this as normal. Men froze in their cabins every winter across the territory. It was considered an unfortunate but unavoidable reality of mountain living. Reese rejected that acceptance. There had to be a better way. Bronwyn had died because their cabin could not retain heat. That meant heat retention was the problem to solve. But how? Thicker logs? Better chinking? Larger fireplaces? He had seen cabins with all these improvements, and they still struggled in extreme cold. The answer, when it began to form in his mind, came not from studying cabins, but from studying the landscape itself. In late May of 1857, Reese was checking trap lines along the northern ridge when he came across something that changed his entire understanding of shelter. Tucked into a cliff face, partially hidden by pine trees, was a rock overhang that had clearly been used as a dwelling. The evidence was unmistakable. Fire-blackened stone where countless fires had burned, worn patches on the rock floor where people had slept, even some scattered remnants of what might have been bedding materials, long since deteriorated. Reese had heard that indigenous peoples used rock shelters, but he had never given it serious thought. Settlers built cabins. That was the civilized way. But standing under that overhang, he felt something that made him pause. The space felt protected. Wind that had been cutting across the ridge completely disappeared under the rock. The temperature, even in open air, felt noticeably different than the exposed forest around him. He returned the next day with a makeshift thermometer he had constructed using a glass tube, colored water, and careful calibration against the freezing and boiling points. It was crude but functional. Outside the rock shelter, the morning temperature read 48 degrees. Under the overhang, 20 feet back from the opening, the temperature read 54 degrees, 6 degrees warmer, with no fire, no walls, nothing but stone overhead. Reese began seeking out other rock formations. Over the next 3 weeks, he found and measured 7 different overhangs and shallow caves. The pattern held consistent. Spaces protected by significant rock mass maintained temperatures noticeably higher than the surrounding air. The effect was more pronounced in deeper formations with southern exposure. He began asking questions of the few indigenous people he encountered during his travels. Most were wary of settlers, understandably so, but one older man from the Salish people agreed to talk with him. Through broken communication and hand gestures, Reese learned that rock shelters had been used for generations during winter months. They were considered superior to any portable structure because the stone held warmth. The old man explained something Reese had not considered. Rock was not just a barrier to wind, it was a holder of heat. During summer, the deep rock absorbed warmth. During winter, it released that warmth slowly, moderating the temperature of spaces within the stone. The deeper and more massive the rock formation, the more stable the temperature remained year-round. Reese returned home with his mind working through implications. If rock itself could maintain stable temperatures, then building inside rock, rather than simply using rock to construct walls, might solve the fundamental problem he had identified. Standard cabins lost heat because wood was a poor thermal mass. It absorbed heat quickly, but also released it quickly. Rock was different. Rock held temperature, buffered extremes, and provided passive climate control that no amount of careful log construction could match. The idea forming in his mind seemed radical. Build a cabin not on the land, but within the land itself. Use the mountain as the primary structure and add only what the mountain could not provide. Through the summer and fall of 1857, Reese conducted what amounted to a scientific study of thermal properties. He visited rock formations repeatedly, measuring temperatures at different times of day and in varying weather conditions. He brought his thermometer to caves, overhangs, and even abandoned mine shafts. He recorded everything in a small notebook, building a data set that revealed patterns most settlers never noticed. Deep caves maintained the most stable temperatures, typically ranging between 50 and 56 degrees regardless of external conditions. Shallow overhangs showed more variation, but still moderated extremes significantly. Southern-facing formations warmed slightly during winter days when sunlight reached them, while northern-facing formations stayed cooler but more stable. The depth of the rock overhead correlated directly with temperature stability. 20 feet of stone provided better moderation than 10 feet, and 40 feet was even more effective. Reese began to understand principles that would not be formally articulated by scientists for decades. Thermal mass was the key concept. Materials with high thermal mass absorbed and released heat slowly. Rock had exceptional thermal mass. Wood had very little. A log cabin heated quickly when fire burned, but lost that heat rapidly when the fire diminished. A cave warmed slowly but maintained temperature far longer because the massive volume of surrounding stone acted as a thermal battery. He also discovered that depth mattered for another reason beyond just the mass of stone overhead. The earth itself maintained a relatively constant temperature below a certain depth. In this region, that temperature averaged around 50 degrees year-round. Caves and rock shelters tapped into this geothermal stability. They were essentially extensions of the Earth's constant temperature zone, protected from the daily and seasonal fluctuations that occurred at the surface. Wind was another factor Reese analyzed. Heat loss from frontier cabins came primarily from air movement. Wind pulled warmth away from exterior walls. Interior air circulated toward any gap or crack, carrying heat outside. Rock shelters eliminated most wind exposure entirely. The stone walls and overhang blocked air movement, creating a protected microclimate within the formation. Moisture management was a concern Reese identified early. Caves could be damp, and dampness made cold feel more penetrating. But he noticed that properly positioned shelters with adequate drainage and air circulation did not suffer from excessive moisture. The key was selecting formations where water drained away naturally and where the opening provided enough airflow to prevent condensation buildup without creating drafts. By October, Reese had filled his notebook with observations and had formed a clear plan. He would find a suitable rock shelter with deep overhang, southern exposure, and good drainage. He would build a minimal structure within that shelter, just enough to create a weather-tight interior space. The rock would provide the primary insulation and thermal management. The cabin would simply be an interior room within the mountain itself. Reese spent November of 1857 searching for the right location. He was not looking for land in the traditional sense. He was looking for specific geology. The formation needed to meet precise requirements. Deep overhang extending at least 30 feet back from the opening. Height sufficient for a cabin with proper roof clearance. Southern exposure to capture winter sunlight. Solid rock floor or ground that could be leveled. Natural drainage to prevent water accumulation. And remoteness, because he knew what he was planning would attract ridicule from other settlers. He found the perfect site on Copper Ridge, 3 miles from where his original cabin stood. The formation was a natural cave with an overhang created by harder rock layers above softer stone that had eroded over millennia. The opening faced southeast, ideal for winter sun. The overhang extended 45 feet back into the mountain, with additional depth in a natural alcove at the rear. The ceiling height varied from 9 feet near the opening to 12 feet at the deepest point. Water drainage was excellent. The cave floor sloped gently toward the opening, and a small channel along one side carried any moisture outside naturally. During rainstorms, Reese observed that water sheeted off the rock face above without entering the protected space. In snow, the overhang prevented accumulation except for the first few feet near the entrance. He measured temperatures obsessively. Morning readings averaged 52 degrees. Afternoon readings reached 55 degrees. Evening temperatures held at 53 degrees. Even during a cold snap in late November, when external temperatures dropped to 15 degrees, the cave interior never fell below 51 degrees. The thermal stability was exactly what his research had predicted. The location had one significant drawback. Hauling materials and supplies 3 miles over rough terrain would be difficult. The path from the valley involved steep switchbacks and narrow passages between rock formations. Moving large logs would be nearly impossible, but Reese realized this was not actually a drawback for his purposes. He did not need large logs. The cave provided walls and ceiling. He needed only to close off the opening and create an interior space, which required relatively modest materials. He claimed the land surrounding the cave entrance, filing paperwork at the territorial office in December. The clerk looked at him strangely when Reese described the location as a cave, but claims were claims. If a man wanted to claim a hole in the mountain, that was his business. Reese spent the winter of 1857 in his original cabin, planning every detail of the construction he would undertake come spring. He sketched designs by firelight. He calculated material needs. He made lists of tools and supplies. And he thought constantly about Bronwyn, about the failure that had taken her, and about the solution he believed would prevent others from experiencing the same loss. Reese began construction in April of 1858. He started by hauling basic materials up to Copper Ridge using a mule and travois, boards hewn from pine trees near the cave entrance, stone for a fireplace, clay and sand for mortar and chinking, tools and hardware. The work was slow and physically demanding, but Reese was methodical and patient. By early May, word had spread among the scattered settler community that Reese Cadogan was building a cabin inside a cave. The first visitors came out of curiosity. Morgan Llewellyn rode up with 2 other settlers, Evan Griffiths and Owen Bevan, to see what the widower was doing. They found Reese framing walls across the cave opening, creating a barrier that would close off the protected space. Morgan dismounted and walked around the site, shaking his head. "You are building inside the mountain itself," he said, his Welsh accent still thick despite years in America. "Like an animal taking shelter in a den." Reese continued working, fitting boards together with careful precision. "The mountain provides what logs cannot: stable temperature and protection from wind." "It is a hole in the ground," Owen said, peering into the darkness beyond Reese's framing. "Dark and damp. No proper man lives like this." Evan was more diplomatic, but equally skeptical. "Reese, I understand you have had terrible loss. Bronwyn's death weighs on all of us. But this," he gestured at the cave, "this is not the answer. You need a proper cabin, built in the open, with sunlight and air." "I have measured the temperature in this cave every day for 6 months," Reese replied. "It never drops below 50 degrees, even in the coldest winter weather. A proper cabin, as you call it, can freeze inside despite a roaring fire. I know this because mine did." Morgan snorted. "You are touched by grief, man. Living in a cave will not bring your wife back." "No," Reese agreed quietly, "but it might prevent others from dying the same way." The 3 men left, convinced that Reese had lost his mind. Morgan spread the story throughout the community. The widower Cadogan was building a cave dwelling like a primitive savage. He had rejected civilization and was regressing to animal behavior. Some attributed it to grief-induced madness. Others saw it as evidence that solitary living in the wilderness broke men's minds. Women in the community expressed pity. "Poor Reese," they would say. "He cannot accept what happened, so he builds a tomb for himself in the mountain." Younger settlers made jokes. They called Copper Ridge the Bear's Den. They speculated about whether Reese would hibernate for the winter. They questioned whether he would emerge in spring or simply disappear into the darkness like a ghost. Even sympathetic neighbors tried to intervene. A minister rode out from the small church community 30 miles away, intending to counsel Reese back toward proper Christian living. He found Reese installing a door frame and launched into a prepared speech about accepting God's will and not turning away from civilized society. Reese listened politely, then said, "Reverend, does God's will include freezing to death in a structure that cannot hold heat? I am not turning away from civilization. I am solving a problem that civilization has failed to solve." The minister left without making progress, reporting back that Reese Cadogan was polite but obstinate, trapped in his grief and beyond reach of reasonable counsel. The structure Reese built inside the cave was unlike any frontier cabin in the territory. He was not constructing a freestanding building. He was creating an interior room within the mountain itself, which required completely different thinking. The front wall, spanning the cave opening, was the only true exterior barrier. Reese built it using vertical boards fitted tightly together, creating a solid barrier against wind and weather. He did not need thick logs, because the cave overhang protected this wall from direct rain and snow. The boards were 2 inches thick, adequate for their purpose. He sealed gaps with a mixture of clay and pine resin, creating a weather-tight seal. The door was positioned slightly off-center in this front wall. Reese built it from thick planks, reinforced with cross braces, simple iron hinges mounted solidly, a wooden bar lock on the interior. Nothing elaborate, because the door did not need to withstand bear attacks or hostile intrusions. The cave itself was the primary defense. The door simply needed to seal against drafts. Side walls were minimal. The cave's natural stone walls provided most of the barrier. Reese only built short partition walls where needed to square off the living space and create storage areas. These walls were light framing with boards, more like interior divisions than structural elements. The ceiling was perhaps the most unconventional aspect. Reese built no ceiling at all. The natural cave ceiling, 40 feet of solid rock, provided insulation far superior to any wooden roof he could construct. He simply left it exposed, allowing the massive thermal mass above to do its work. The fireplace received most of Rees's attention. He built it against the back wall of the cave, constructing a stone firebox with careful attention to draft and heat radiation. The chimney was critical. He needed to vent smoke without creating a draw that would pull warm air out of the space. He designed a chimney that extended only partway up, venting into the upper reaches of the cave, where smoke could dissipate naturally through cracks and fissures in the rock without creating strong updraft. The floor was simply the cave's natural stone, which Rees leveled in places by filling low spots with gravel and sand. He built a raised wooden sleeping platform to keep his bed off the cold stone. A simple table and bench, shelves mounted to the cave walls, storage boxes for supplies. Lighting was a concern. The cave was naturally dark, especially deep inside. Rees positioned his living area near the front where daylight penetrated. He cut one small window in the front wall, covered with oiled paper initially and glass later. The window was small, just enough for light without creating significant heat loss. Ventilation required careful balance. The space needed air circulation to prevent dampness and provide oxygen for the fire, but too much airflow would negate the thermal advantages. Rees created small vents near the floor and ceiling that could be opened or closed as needed, allowing him to control airflow precisely. By September of 1858, Rees had completed his cave cabin and moved in permanently. He dismantled his original cabin in the valley, salvaging materials and hauling them up to Copper Ridge. The sight of the empty cabin site, where Bronwyn had died, brought complicated emotions. Relief to leave that place, sadness that it represented failure, determination that his new shelter would succeed where the old one had not. Settlers who visited Copper Ridge that fall came away with mixed reactions. Some were surprised by how comfortable the space felt. The interior was dry, reasonably well lit near the front, and undeniably warmer than the exterior temperature. But cultural bias was strong. Living in a cave felt wrong to people who equated civilization with constructed buildings and cleared land. Morgan Llewellyn was the most vocal critic. He had built a new cabin that summer, larger and more elaborate than his previous structure. 24 feet by 20 feet, with a full loft, 2 glass windows, and a stone fireplace that had required 3 weeks to construct. He was proud of his work and considered it evidence of proper frontier craftsmanship. "Look at what a man can build when he applies himself correctly," Morgan said to others, gesturing at his cabin. "That is civilization. That is progress." Cadogan, hiding in his hole, represents retreat and defeat. Owen Bevan had built similarly. His cabin featured hand-hewn logs fitted with precision, corner joints he had learned from a Swedish carpenter, and a roof that he believed was completely waterproof. He invited neighbors to admire his work, pointing out details and craftsmanship. Even Evan Griffiths, who was generally sympathetic to Rees, had built a traditional cabin. His was more modest than Morgan's or Owen's, but it stood openly on cleared land with a view of the valley, embodying the frontier ideal of man imposing order on wilderness. These men had invested significant time, effort, and pride in their structures. Rees's approach felt like an implicit criticism of their choices. If a cave was superior, then their elaborate cabins were wasteful and foolish. That implication bred resentment. Women in the community pitied Rees more than criticized him. They brought him food occasionally, checking on the widower living alone in his strange dwelling. They found the cave cabin unsettling. Too dark, too enclosed, too much like a tomb. They could not imagine raising children in such a place or maintaining a proper household. One woman told her husband that visiting Rees felt like descending into a grave. By winter's approach, Rees had become the community eccentric. People spoke of him with mixture of pity and derision, the man who chose darkness over light, the widower who could not move past his grief, the settler who had given up on civilization. His cave cabin on Copper Ridge became a cautionary tale parents used with children. That is what happens when a man lets tragedy break his mind. The winter of 1858 arrived in early November with the first significant snowfall. Reese watched from his cave entrance as thick flakes accumulated on the ground outside, disappearing into darkness beyond the protective overhang. Inside his space, the temperature held steady at 54 degrees. He had a small fire burning, not for heat primarily, but for light and cooking. The flames were modest, consuming perhaps 3 small logs over the course of an entire day. He had installed his thermometer prominently on the interior wall, checking it multiple times daily and recording the readings in his notebook. Morning of November 12th, 53 degrees. Afternoon, 55 degrees. Evening, 54 degrees. Outside temperature, according to a second thermometer he had mounted just beyond the cave entrance, was 28 degrees. The 25-degree differential existed without significant fire, maintained purely by the thermal mass of the surrounding rock. As November progressed and temperatures dropped further, Reese's pattern remained consistent. He woke each morning to a space that was comfortably cool but far from cold. He maintained his small fire throughout the day, adding logs only when needed for cooking or additional warmth during the coldest nights. His wood consumption was remarkably low. A single cord of firewood, he calculated, would last him the entire winter with surplus remaining. By contrast, he knew from conversations with other settlers that traditional cabins were already burning through wood at alarming rates. Morgan had mentioned during a chance encounter that he was feeding his fire, constantly going through nearly half a cord per week. Evan had expressed concern about whether his wood supply would last until spring. Owen had already started rationing, trying to extend his stockpile. December brought temperatures well below zero on multiple occasions. Reese recorded external readings of 10 below, 15 below, even 20 below zero during one particularly brutal cold snap. Inside the cave cabin, the temperature dropped to 49 degrees during that coldest period. Uncomfortable certainly, but nowhere near dangerous. Reese added more wood to his fire, and the interior temperature rose back to 53 degrees within an hour. The rock mass stabilized everything, preventing the wild temperature swings that plagued traditional cabins. He began to notice other advantages beyond just temperature stability. The cave was utterly silent. Wind that howled across the ridge completely disappeared once inside the rock shelter. Snow that drifted to depths of 3 feet in the open barely dusted the cave entrance. The protected space remained dry even during storms that brought heavy precipitation. His supplies stayed in perfect condition without the moisture and temperature fluctuations that caused food spoilage in standard cabins. Reese's health remained good throughout the winter. He did not suffer from the respiratory ailments that often plagued settlers living in poorly ventilated, smoke-filled cabins. The cave's natural airflow, combined with his carefully designed venting system, kept air quality high without creating drafts. He slept well, worked on small projects during short winter days, and felt none of the oppressive cabin fever that drove some men to dangerous decisions during long winters. By February, he knew his approach had succeeded. The cave cabin had performed exactly as his research predicted. He was warm, safe, and consuming minimal resources. Bronwyn's death had not been in vain. He had learned from that tragedy and created something that solved the problem that had killed her. The summer and fall of 1859 passed uneventfully for most settlers in the territory. Crops grew adequately. Game remained plentiful. New families arrived claiming land and building cabins. The community expanded slowly, as frontier communities did, with births and arrivals, balancing deaths and departures. Reese lived quietly at Copper Ridge, emerging occasionally to trade furs and purchase supplies, but mostly keeping to himself. In late September, unusual signs began appearing that concerned the oldest settlers. Animals behaved strangely. Squirrels and chipmunks gathered food with frantic intensity, building larger caches than normal. Birds migrated earlier than usual, with flocks departing in late September rather than October. Deer moved down from the high country weeks ahead of their typical pattern. Even insects seemed affected, with colonies of ants building unusually large and deep mounds. Old trappers and hunters recognized these signs. Animals possessed instincts that predicted weather patterns beyond human capability. When animals prepared for hard winter, humans should pay attention. An old French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste stopped at Morgan's cabin in early October and warned him directly. "The animals know something we don't," Baptiste said. "This winter will be bad, worse than usual. Stock extra wood and food if you want to see spring." Morgan thanked him for the advice but was not overly concerned. He had survived Montana winters before. He had built a solid cabin and had already begun accumulating his firewood supply. By mid-October, he had 8 cords split and stacked, which seemed more than adequate. His neighbors prepared similarly. Owen stockpiled 9 cords. Evan had 7, standard preparation for a standard winter. Reese heard the warnings and observed the animal behavior himself. He increased his own wood supply modestly, splitting an additional half-cord beyond his normal preparation. But he was not worried. His cave cabin had performed flawlessly the previous winter, and he had no reason to expect different results regardless of how cold the season became. November arrived with temperatures that confirmed the warnings. The first week brought cold that would normally appear in late December, 0 degrees by mid-month, 10 below by Thanksgiving. Settlers began burning through their wood supplies faster than anticipated, but most still believed they had adequate reserves. A cold start did not necessarily mean a cold finish. Winters varied, and warm spells often followed cold snaps. December destroyed that optimism. Temperatures never rose above 0 for the entire month. Most days saw readings between 10 and 20 below 0. Several nights reached 30 below. Snow accumulated in massive quantities, with drifts reaching heights that made travel nearly impossible. Storms arrived in waves, each bringing additional snow and driving winds that cut through any clothing. Cabins across the territory struggled. Fires burned constantly, consuming wood at double or triple normal rates. Families huddled near fireplaces wearing every piece of clothing they owned, still cold despite flames roaring just feet away. Ice formed on interior walls. Water buckets froze solid. The cold penetrated everything, relentless and inescapable. January 14, 1860, marked the coldest morning Morgan Llewellyn had ever experienced. He woke to the sound of his water bucket cracking, ice expanding within the wooden container, despite sitting 3 feet from a fireplace that had burned all night. The thermometer outside read 12 below 0. Inside his cabin, with massive fire consuming logs at a rate he could barely sustain, the temperature was perhaps 40 degrees. His wife Margaret had been up since before dawn, feeding wood into flames that seemed to provide light but inadequate heat. Their children in the loft were bundled in every blanket. The family owned, whimpering from cold that penetrated their shared body heat. Frost coated the interior walls where breath and body heat met frozen logs. The chinking between logs had contracted, opening gaps that admitted wind. The cabin was failing. Morgan walked outside to assess his wood supply. He had started winter with 8 cords, believing it sufficient. Now, halfway through January, he had less than 3 cords remaining. At current consumption rates, he would run out by early March with 6 weeks of winter still ahead. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. He did not have enough wood to survive the season. He was not alone. Owen's situation was similar. Despite starting with 9 cords, his larger cabin and constant fires had depleted his supply to dangerous levels. Evan, with his smaller supply, was already rationing wood, letting his fire diminish at night and accepting cold mornings to extend his reserves. Several other families faced the same calculation. Their wood would not last. The cold had physical weight. It pressed against structures, seeking entry through every weakness. Doors that had fit tightly in autumn now had gaps around their frames. Windows leaked air despite being shuttered. Roofs, designed to shed rain and snow, conducted cold downward into living spaces. The very logs that formed cabin walls became conduits for freezing temperatures, drawing heat outward while admitting cold inward. People began making desperate decisions. Some families burned furniture when firewood ran low. Others burned parts of their cabins, dismantling interior walls or removing roof boards to feed fires. A few abandoned their cabins entirely, moving in with neighbors who had better supplies, crowding multiple families into single structures to share resources and body heat. 2 miles away at Copper Ridge, Reese sat at his table in shirt sleeves, eating breakfast in comfort. His thermometer read 53 degrees, outside the same 12 below zero. That was devastating. Morgan's family barely affected the cave cabin. The massive rock formation surrounding Reese's space maintained its thermal stability regardless of external temperature. His small fire, burning lazily in the stone fireplace, consumed perhaps 2 logs per day. He was warm, comfortable, and safe. He did not yet know about the crisis unfolding in the valley below. He lived alone, and winter isolation was normal. But soon the suffering of his neighbors would reach him in a way that would validate everything he had built. By late January of 1860, the situation in the valley had become truly dangerous. Temperatures remained locked below zero, with multiple days reaching 20 and 30 below. The brief warm spells that normally punctuated Montana winters never materialized. The cold was relentless, unbroken, and deadly. Morgan's family was burning through their remaining wood with terrifying speed. 3 cords had dwindled to 2, then 1.5. Margaret stopped cooking hot meals to conserve fuel. They ate cold, preserved food and allowed the fire to diminish during midday, when pale sunlight provided minimal warmth through the windows. At night, they stoked the fire high, knowing that letting it die could mean freezing before morning. Their children had stopped playing. They simply huddled together, conserving energy and body hot. Owen's situation had become critical faster. His larger cabin required more heat, and his wood supply hit dangerous levels by month's end. He made the difficult decision to move his family in with Morgan, combining their remaining resources. 2 families now occupied Morgan's cabin, 13 people total, crowding into a space designed for 5. The body heat helped, but the increased occupancy meant more breath condensing on walls, more moisture creating ice, and faster depletion of the shared wood supply. Evan had already burned his furniture. Table, chairs, even the bed frame had been split and fed into his fireplace. He slept on the floor now, wrapped in blankets, feeding the fire with scraps of wood gleaned from anywhere he could find them. He had started dismantling his shed, prying boards loose and carrying them inside. The mathematics haunted him. He had perhaps 2 weeks of fuel remaining if he rationed severely. Spring was at least 6 weeks away. Other families faced similar desperation. A settler named Thomas Pritchard had moved his wife and 4 children into his tiny storage cabin after running completely out of firewood. The storage cabin was smaller and easier to heat, but it was never designed for habitation. They survived by burning everything combustible they owned and huddling together in the darkness. The community tried to help each other. Those with surplus wood shared with those in dire need. But surplus was relative. Everyone was burning through supplies faster than anticipated. Sharing meant spreading inadequate resources across more people, helping everyone survive slightly longer, but solving nothing fundamental. The cold did not care about community solidarity. It simply took whatever heat was available and demanded more. 2 deaths occurred in early February. An elderly couple living alone in a remote cabin froze when their fire went out during the night. They were found days later when a neighbor finally managed to reach their location through deep snow. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. This was not supposed to happen. Settlers were supposed to survive winters. But the cold had overwhelmed their preparations. Children were suffering visibly. Their lips showed blue tinge despite being near fires. Their fingers and toes displayed early signs of frostbite. Some had stopped eating, their bodies shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy. Parents watched helplessly, knowing they were failing at the most basic requirement of parenthood, keeping their children alive. Morgan stood outside his crowded cabin on February 10th, looking toward Copper Ridge 3 miles distant. Reese Cadogan was up there in his cave, the community eccentric, the man who had rejected civilization. Morgan wondered, not for the first time that winter, whether Reese was suffering like everyone else, or whether his strange choice had somehow proved wise. Evan Griffiths left his cabin at midnight on February 13, 1860, carrying his youngest daughter wrapped in blankets. His wife and 2 other children remained behind, huddled near a fire that was consuming the last of their wood. Evan had made a decision born of desperation. He was going to Copper Ridge to ask Reese for help, and if Reese refused, Evan did not know what he would do. The journey through deep snow and darkness was treacherous. Temperature was 15 below zero. Wind cut across the exposed slopes between valley and ridge. Evan's face went numb within minutes. His daughter, 7 years old, pressed against his chest, barely moved. He talked to her constantly, trying to keep her conscious, but she did not respond. He walked faster, driven by fear that was stronger than exhaustion. He reached the cave entrance near 2 in the morning. Light glowed from within, visible through the front wall that Reese had constructed. Evan pounded on the door with his free hand, shouting Reese's name. The door opened quickly. Reese stood there in shirt and pants, not even wearing a coat. The warmth that spilled from the doorway was shocking. "My daughter," Evan said, his voice breaking. "She is freezing. We have no wood left. Please." Reese pulled them inside immediately. The temperature difference was so extreme that Evan's vision blurred. He had been cold for so long that warmth felt painful. Reese took the child from his arms and carried her to the sleeping platform, wrapping her in dry blankets and positioning her near the small fire that burned steadily in the stone fireplace. Evan stood in the center of the cave cabin, shaking from cold and shock and relief. The space was comfortable, not hot, but genuinely warm. His thermometer, mounted on the wall where Evan could see it clearly, read 53 degrees. 53 degrees inside a Afikta cave. In the middle of the worst winter in memory, with only a small fire burning. "How?" Evan asked, the word barely audible. Reese was checking the child's fingers and toes, looking for frostbite. "The rock holds temperature," he said quietly. "The mountain provides what cabins cannot." Evan walked to the thermometer and touched it, verifying it was real. He looked around the space, seeing details he had not noticed during his previous critical visits. The massive stone ceiling overhead, the solid rock walls on 3 sides, the minimal wooden construction that was obviously not providing the warmth, the small fire that was barely more than coals. Everything he had believed about shelter and survival was wrong. "Your family," Reese said. "They are still at your cabin?" Evan nodded. "We have perhaps 1 day of wood remaining." "Bring them here," Reese said. "Tonight. All of them. This space can hold more people, and I have surplus wood." Evan wanted to refuse out of pride, but pride meant nothing when children were dying. "Thank you," he managed. His daughter stirred on the sleeping platform, her color already improving in the warmth. Reese brought her water and spoke to her gently. She drank and looked around with confused eyes, not understanding where she was or why she suddenly felt warm. Evan returned to his cabin with Reese before dawn. Together they loaded Evan's wife and remaining children onto a makeshift sled and hauled them through the snow to Copper Ridge. By sunrise, Evan's entire family was inside the cave cabin, experiencing warmth they had not felt in weeks. The children cried with relief. Evan's wife kept touching the walls, the floor, the thermometer, trying to understand how this space could be so different from their cabin. Reese shared his food and showed them how to navigate the space. 5 people now occupied the cave cabin comfortably. The temperature remained stable. The small fire continued burning at the same modest rate, requiring no additional fuel despite the increased occupancy. Body heat from 5 people actually raised the interior temperature slightly, to 55 degrees. Everyone removed their heavy coats for the first time in months. Word spread rapidly. Evan told Morgan what he had found. Morgan did not believe him initially, thinking the cold had affected Evan's mind. But Evan's insistence and his family's obvious recovery convinced Morgan to investigate. He made the journey to Copper Ridge and stood in the cave entrance, experiencing the same shock Evan had felt. The warmth was real. The thermometer reading was accurate. Reese's strange cave dwelling actually worked. Morgan returned to his crowded cabin and told Owen and the others. Skepticism gave way to desperate hope. If Reese's space could shelter Evan's family, perhaps other rock formations could provide similar refuge. Several men began searching the surrounding ridges for overhangs and caves. They found a few possibilities, but nothing with the depth and protection of Reese's site. Reese, meanwhile, had begun thinking about the broader implications. His cave cabin could shelter more than just Evan's family. The space was large enough for perhaps 15 people if they crowded together. He sent word through Evan that families in the most desperate situations were welcome to come to Copper Ridge. Some accepted immediately. Others hesitated, pride warring with necessity. By late February, 11 people were living in the cave cabin. Children who had been near death recovered quickly in the stable warmth. Adults who had burned through their wood supplies found safety. The space was crowded but functional. Reese's wood supply, which would have lasted him through 3 winters alone, was adequate for the group through the remaining weeks of cold. The Maud. Community's perception of Reese transformed completely. The eccentric cave dweller became the man who had saved lives. Morgan publicly admitted he had been wrong to mock Reese's choice. Owen acknowledged that conventional wisdom about cabin construction was flawed. Even the minister who had tried to counsel Reese back to civilization rode out to Copper Ridge and offered apology, recognizing that survival wisdom came in unexpected forms. People who had not sheltered at Copper Ridge came to see the cave cabin for themselves. They measured the temperature, they examined the construction, they asked detailed questions about how Reese had selected the site and what principles governed his design. Knowledge that Reese had developed through observation and experiment became community property, shared freely with anyone who wanted to learn. Spring arrived late in 1860. Snow persisted through March, and temperatures did not rise above freezing consistently until mid-April. But when warmth finally came, it revealed a landscape transformed by the brutal winter. Abandoned cabins with doors hanging open, wood supplies completely exhausted, damaged structures where settlers had burned parts of their own homes to survive, and a community that had learned a hard lesson about the inadequacy of conventional shelter. Owen Bevan was the first to act on that lesson. In early May, he began exploring the ridges and cliff faces within 10 miles of his land. He was looking for rock formations similar to Reese's site. After 3 weeks of searching, he found a suitable overhang on the eastern slope of Timber Ridge. The formation was not as deep as Copper Ridge, only 20 feet of overhang compared to Reese's 45 feet, but it faced south and offered solid protection. Owen approached Reese for advice. Reese spent 2 days at the new site, measuring temperatures, checking drainage, and evaluating the rock stability. He confirmed that Owen's selection would work, though perhaps not quite as effectively as Copper Ridge. The reduced depth meant slightly less thermal mass, but it would still maintain temperatures far superior to any exposed cabin. Owen began construction immediately, building a simple structure within the overhang using techniques similar to Reese's design. Front wall to close off the opening, minimal side walls, stone fireplace at the rear, no ceiling because the rock provided that function. By July, Owen had moved into his cave cabin and dismantled his valley structure. He reported that even in summer heat, the cave remained comfortably cool around 60 degrees. while exposed cabins became stifling. Other settlers followed Owen's example. Morgan Llewellyn found a shallow cave formation that required more extensive front wall construction, but still provided significant thermal advantages. A family named the Thatchers discovered a deep overhang perfect for their needs. Within a year, 7 families in the immediate area had built cave-integrated structures or were planning to do so. The technique began spreading beyond the local community. Travelers passing through heard stories of the brutal winter and the cave cabins that had saved lives. Word reached other settlements in Montana Territory and beyond. Miners working in mountainous regions started seeking rock shelters rather than building exposed structures. Trappers who had previously built temporary lean-tos began identifying and using natural overhangs for winter camps. Reese found himself in the unexpected role of teacher and consultant. People sought his advice on site selection, construction techniques, and thermal management. He shared everything he had learned, drawing diagrams, explaining principles, and helping evaluate potential locations. He never charged for this knowledge. The information had cost him Bronwyn's life to acquire. Making others pay for it seemed wrong. The phrase cave cabin or rock shelter cabin entered common usage in the territory. Settlers distinguished between traditional exposed cabins and the newer cave-integrated designs. Real estate values shifted subtly, with land containing suitable rock formations becoming more desirable than open valley land that had previously been preferred. Not everyone adopted the new approach. Some settlers remained in traditional cabins, either because suitable rock formations were not available on their land or because cultural resistance to cave dwelling persisted. But those who did make the transition reported universal satisfaction: lower wood consumption, stable temperatures, better protection from weather, and the peace of mind that came from knowing their shelter could withstand extreme conditions. Reese Cadogan lived at Copper Ridge for 19 more years after the winter of 1860. He never remarried, though several women in the community expressed interest. He maintained his cave cabin, improved it gradually over time, and lived a life of quiet self-sufficiency. He trapped occasionally, sold furs when he needed supplies, and spent long hours reading books he purchased during trips to larger settlements. He became a fixture in the community's memory, the man whose unconventional thinking had saved lives. But as years passed and new settlers arrived who had not experienced that brutal winter, the story faded from immediate consciousness into local history. Younger people knew Reese as the old man who lived in the cave, but they did not always know why or understand the significance of his choice. The cave cabins themselves persisted as the most visible legacy. By 1870, over 30 cave-integrated structures existed within a 100-mile radius of Copper Ridge. Some were simple shelters used seasonally. Others were permanent homes occupied year-round. A few had been expanded significantly, with additional rooms built within large cave systems, creating underground homesteads that remained comfortable in all weather. The technique spread into other regions as Montana Territory developed. Homesteaders arriving under the Homestead Act of 1862 sought rock formations when available. Mining camps in mountainous areas used natural overhangs for worker housing. The U.S. Army, establishing frontier posts, occasionally utilized rock shelters for storage and specialized facilities where temperature stability was important. Engineers and builders began to understand the principles Reese had discovered through observation. Thermal mass, geothermal stability, wind protection, and passive climate control became recognized concepts. Some applied these principles to improve traditional construction, building thicker walls with stone or using earth berming to gain thermal benefits. Others continued building cave-integrated structures where geology permitted. Reese died in November of 1878 at the age of 61. He had been chopping firewood despite his age, insisting he did not need help. His heart simply stopped. A neighbor found him the next day, collapsed near his woodpile, tools still in hand. The community buried him next to Bronwyn on the hillside above his original cabin site. His gravestone read simply, Rees Cadogan, 1817 to 1878. He built with wisdom. The cave cabin on Copper Ridge remained occupied for another 40 years. Various families and individuals lived there after Rees's death, each benefiting from the structure he had created. The space required minimal maintenance. The rock provided protection that wooden structures could not match. By the early 20th century, the cabin was finally abandoned, but the structure itself remained intact. The story of Rees Cadogan illustrates important truths about frontier innovation. Tragedy drove observation. Observation revealed principles. Principles guided action. And action grounded in understanding rather than convention produced solutions that saved lives. Rees proved that survival sometimes meant embracing ancient wisdom and questioning assumptions. His legacy was built into rock shelters across Montana Territory, standing silent testament to what determination and unconventional thinking could accomplish on the American frontier.